My father called me the mistake for the first time when I was 6 years old, not in anger. That is the part I have spent most times with, in the years since. The fact that he said it without heat, without the excuse of a raised voice or a moment lost to emotion. He said it the way people state facts about weather or geography. Matter of fact. Settled. As if the name had always existed and he was simply using it. Table. We were at the dinner table. My sister Lily was telling a story about something that had happened at school, and my father was watching her with the particular expression he reserved for her. Open, warm, keen, leaned slightly forward, the expression of a man watching something he is proud to have made. And I knocked over cross-relational. It spread across the table in the way milk spreads, completely, immediately, heat, with no possibility of reversal. My father looked at me, he said, "That's about right, that's the mistake for you." He said it with a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Keen. Then he handed me a dish towel and went back to watching Lily finish her story. I cleaned up the milk. I did not cry. I was 6 years old, and I was already very good at not crying about certain things, which tells you something about how long certain things had already been happening. I did not know, that night, that the name had a history longer than my own life. That it had been born in a hospital room, before I could speak or understand or carry a dish towel. That my father had arrived at that dinner table with a version of me already constructed. A version built not from who I was, but from the circumstances of how I arrived. I did not know that there were documents. That hospitals keep records. That the truth of a family, when it exists in paperwork, does not disappear simply because no one chooses to read it aloud. It took me 27 years to find the paperwork. And when I did, the name The Mistake finally made sense. Not because it was accurate, but because I finally understood where it had come from, and what it had actually been saying, and who it had really been about. It had never been about me at all. Stay with me. Either. This is not a comfortable story, and I am not going to make it comfortable, because I think the discomfort is the part that matters. Subscribe if you're new, and if you have ever been named something by someone who was supposed to protect you. This one is for you. My name is Jess. I am 33 years old. I am a trauma-informed therapist in private practice in Portland, Oregon, which is the most predictable sentence I could write about myself, and also the most true. I work with adults who grew up in families where the rules were not spoken, and the damage was not acknowledged. And the children did the labor of making sense of things that adults had decided not to explain. I am good at this work. I have been told I am unusually good at sitting with people in the parts of their history that feel too dark to look at directly. I learned this in supervision and in my own therapy, and also, before either of those things, in the particular training of my own childhood, where I learned to read rooms, to anticipate shifts, to locate the hidden logic in situations that presented themselves as arbitrary. Nothing in my family was arbitrary. I understood this, dimly and then clearly, across the course of my growing up. There was a logic. There was always a logic. I just didn't have access to the premises. I grew up in a mid-sized city in Georgia. My father is a former high school football coach, now retired. A man built for authority, for the management of groups, for the particular kind of love that expresses itself through high standards and withheld praise, and the occasional significant gesture of approval that lands all the harder for its rarity. He is not a villain. I want to establish that now, not to protect him but to be accurate, because accuracy is what I have always traded in. He is a man who was damaged in specific ways, and who transmitted that damage in specific ways, and who, I now believe, did not fully understand what he was doing or why. My mother left when I was 9. This is the fact I have always led with in my own therapy, because it is the largest structural event of my childhood, the one that reorganized everything around it. She did not leave dramatically. She left the way people leave when they have already been leaving for a long time, and the physical departure is simply the last step in a process completed much earlier. She moved to Atlanta. She called on birthdays and some holidays. She sent cards with $20 in them, which I later recognized as the specific amount a person sends when they want to signal love without maintaining it. Boy. I was raised primarily by my father, and in the crucial secondary way, by my sister Lily's presence, by the contrast she provided, by the mirror she held up, by the way watching how he treated her taught me, by inverse logic, what I was in his accounting. Lily is 2 years older than me. She is luminous in the way certain people are luminous. It is not simply beauty, though she has that too, but a quality of being entirely herself, without apology, without the constant self-monitoring that I developed early as a survival strategy. She moved through our house, like someone who belonged there, in a way I privately envied and publicly celebrated. Because Lily herself never did anything to cause the difference between us. She did not ask to be the princess. She did not design the system. She was simply inside it, receiving what it offered, in the way children receive the conditions of their lives before they have the tools to question them. My father called her the princess from the time she was small. He said it with the same matter-of-factness he said the mistake, as if these were simply accurate descriptions, taxonomical. The way you describe eye color or height. Lily is the princess, Jess is the mistake. These are the facts of this family. Lily hated it. I want to be clear about this. She hated her name as much as I hated mine. She told me so, with increasing articulation as we grew older. That the princess felt like a cage dressed as a compliment. That the expectations attached to it were their own kind of pressure. That she was not allowed to fail or struggle, or be ordinary, without feeling like she was betraying the name he had given her. We were both trapped in his naming. The names were two sides of the same thing, and that thing was about him, not us. I could not have told you that at 10 or 15 or even 20. I can tell you it now because I know what I know and I did the work it took to know it. But I am getting ahead of myself. Growing up as the mistake in a house with the princess is a specific educations. You learn, first, that the rules are different. Not sometimes, consistently, and without acknowledged justification. Lily had a curfew that was discussed and negotiated. I had a curfew that was enforced without discussion and changed without notice. Lily's friends were welcome in the house and fed and treated with warmth. My friends were tolerated with a particular air of assessment, as if my father were deciding whether they reflected well or poorly on a judgment he had already made about me. Lily's achievements, and she had many, even if she was genuinely excellent at school, and at the clarinet, and at the 100 small social graces that make a person likable, were celebrated with a visibility that filled the house. My achievements were received with a nod, or with a raised bar. Good. What's next? You learn, second, that the difference is not something you can resolve through behavior. I tested this theory exhaustively across the course of my childhood. I was an excellent student. I was obedient, helpful, quiet, useful. I did not create problems. I was, by any measurable external standard, an easier child than most. None of it moved the needle. The name stayed. The dynamic stayed. Whatever I was in my father's accounting had been set before I had any input into the account, deeply. And no deposit I made was sufficient to change the balance. This is the specific cruelty of being named by a parent before you can name yourself. You spend your childhood trying to earn your way out of a verdict that was issued before your evidence was available. You exhaust yourself performing adequacy for an audience that has already decided the show. And when the performance doesn't work, when you clean up the milk and take the dish towel and make yourself small and excellent and unproblematic, and the mistake persists, you eventually arrive at the conclusion that the performance is the problem, that you are, in some fundamental way, what you have been named. I arrived at that conclusion at approximately age 11. I carried it, with varying degrees of awareness and varying degrees of damage, until I was 33 years old and sitting in a hospital records office in Georgia with a manila folder in my hands. My father had a heart attack 2 years ago. He is alive. This story has a habit of containing near losses that do not complete themselves, which I find meaningful in ways I am still mapping. He is alive and recovering, and somewhat diminished in the particular way that health crises diminish people who have organized their lives around strength, around authority, around the management of image, and the suppression of anything that resembles weakness. I flew to Georgia, Irohan. I had not been home in 3 years. Not from abandonment, but from the particular calculation of a therapist who has done enough of her own work to understand that some environments require careful management of exposure. I visited. I maintained the relationship. I kept the connection at a distance I could sustain, without losing ground I had worked very hard to gain. But a heart attack is a heart attack. I flew. I managed his hospitalization with the competence that is apparently my primary inheritance from this family. The capacity to organize a crisis, to make the calls, to translate the medical information, to be useful in the exact ways usefulness is required. I was there for 10 days. I arranged his discharge. I organized home care. I cleaned his house and stocked his refrigerator, and sat with him in the evenings. In the way you sit with a person when the ordinary barriers have been temporarily lowered by fear and proximity, and the general truth-telling properties of mortality. He did not, in those 10 days, say anything that directly addressed the history between us. My father is not a man who says those things, and a heart attack, I learned, does not automatically produce them. What it produced was a version of him that was quieter, more present, occasionally grateful, a softening that felt significant without being a resolution. On the 7th day, he asked me to pick up some paperwork from his doctor's office, forms needed for insurance processing. The doctor's office was in the same building as the hospital where I had been born. I did not plan what happened next. I am not a person who acts impulsively as a general rule. But I was standing in the building where my life had begun, and I had been sleeping in my father's house for 7 days, and reading the room the way I had read it my entire childhood, and something in me, the part that has always known there was a premise I was missing, walked to the medical records office and made a request. I requested my own birth records. I had every legal right to them. I presented my identification. I waited 20 minutes. They handed me a folder. I sat in my rental car in the hospital parking garage for 2 hours. I want to tell you what I found, and I will. But first I want to tell you what it felt like to hold the folder before I opened it. Because that moment, the weight of it in my hands, the particular texture of paper that contains information you have needed your entire life and not known how to find. That moment is part of the story. I was 33 years old. I was a licensed therapist with a master's degree and years of training in family systems and intergenerational trauma and the specific ways that parents transmit unprocessed damage to their children. I knew, in the clinical and theoretical sense, that the name I had been given reflected something in my father rather than something in me. I had worked on this with multiple therapists over many years. I had processed, examined, contextualized, reframed, and I was sitting in a parking garage afraid to open a folder. Because knowing something clinically is not the same as knowing it. Because reframing a wound is not the same as finding the wound's actual source. Because I had spent 27 years with a name and a theory about the name. And what I was holding was the possibility of the fact, the actual event, the thing that had happened in this building, before I was old enough to remember any of it, that had produced who look at his 6-year-old daughter cleaning up spilled milk and call her the mistake, without heat, without apology, as simple declarative fact. I opened the folder. The records were detailed. Hospital records are their own archive. Clinical, time-stamped, the bureaucratic annotation of the most significant moments of people's lives. There were pages of standard information, my birth weight, my length, my APGAR score ors, the names of the attending physician and nursing staff, and there were notes. Intake notes, progress notes, the observational record kept by the nursing staff during those first days. There was a note from the second day that I have since memorized, not because I wanted to, but because certain sentences, when you read them, arrange themselves permanently in your memory without asking permission. The note was brief. It documented my father's behavior in the maternity ward, 18. It documented that he had been observed by 2 nursing staff members noted by name to have spent the majority of visiting hours in the room of another patient on the same ward. A patient who was not my mother, a patient who had given birth the day before I was born, and whose child, a daughter, noted in the record only as the other patient's infant. He had been observed holding and photographing with what the nurse described, with the careful neutrality of professional documentation, as apparent emotional investment, inconsistent with his relationship to the patient. I sat with that sentence for a long time. Apparent emotional investment, inconsistent with his relationship to the patient. I turned pages. There were other notes, a record of my mother's distress during the hospital stay, noted and addressed by staff. A note documenting that my father had been spoken to by a charge nurse about appropriate ward conduct. A note on the third day recording that he had not returned. I put the folder down on the passenger seat. I looked at the concrete wall of the parking garage. I understood. My father had not been present for my birth in any way that mattered. Not because he was unavailable. Because he was in another room. Because there was another child, born one day before me in the same hospital, to a woman who was not my mother, who had occupied his attention and his emotion and his apparent investment in those first days of my life while I was being measured and scored and recorded and held by nurses whose names I had just learned for the first time from their signatures in a folder. The mistake was not a name about who I was. It was a name about what I represented. I was the child born into the consequences of his choices. I was the infant who arrived at the worst possible moment in the marriage. My mother would leave 4 years later. I was the third day of a hospital stay during which my father had been spoken to by a charge nurse and had not returned. I was the proof of a family that was already fracturing before I could focus my eyes. He had named me for his own failure. He had taken the thing he could not face in himself, the choices, the other room, the other child, the marriage he was destroying with his own behavior. And he had folded it into a name and given it to me to carry. I had been carrying his shame for 27 years. I thought I had understood what therapy was for. I had done years of therapy. I had processed the name, examined its effects, worked to separate my identity from my father's characterization of it. And I had done all of that without knowing the actual fact. The actual fact was in a manila folder in a parking garage in Georgia, and it took me 2 hours to get back in my body enough to drive. I called my therapist from the parking garage. This is what we have therapists for, the moments when the information exceeds the immediate capacity to hold it. When you need another regulated nervous system to your own dysregulated one. She answered. I told her what I had found. She stayed on the phone with me for 45 minutes, while I sat in the concrete and the fluorescent light and let the information move through me. She said, at one point, Evil, you've been carrying his story. You just found out it was always his story. I held the phone and looked at the folder on the passenger seat and thought about 6 years old, and spilled milk, and a dish towel, and a name said without heat. He had named me his mistake, because I was born into one. I did not confront my father that night, or the next night, or before I flew home. This is a decision I made with full awareness, applying both my professional training and my own particular knowledge of this man, and I am at peace with it. He had just had a heart attack. He was 67 years old. He was diminished and frightened, and somewhere underneath the authority he had always organized himself around was a man who had spent 33 years unable to look at what he had actually done and why. Yeah. I was not going to break through that in his living room, 3 days after a cardiac event, while he was on blood thinners. I was also not going to pretend the folder didn't exist. What I did was this. Ita. I finished my 10 days. I organized his discharge. I stocked his refrigerator. On my last evening, after dinner, I sat across from him in his living room, and I said, I want to talk about things when you're stronger. Not today. But I want you to know I'm going to want to talk. He looked at me for a long time. My father has always been able to read a room. It was one of his professional assets as a coach, Giru. The ability to assess what was being communicated below the surface. He read me in that moment with the precision of a man who has known, somewhere below the level of acknowledgement, this conversation would eventually arrive. He said, okay. One word. Load-bearing. The conversation happened 4 months later. I flew back in February. He was stronger, stable, people. The cardiac rehabilitation had progressed well and some of his authority had returned. Though quieter, less reflexive than before. I chose February deliberately. Far enough from the emergency to allow genuine conversation, close enough to the mortality that the truth-telling properties had not fully dissipated. I will not give you the conversation verbatim, Hebe. It belongs to us, to him, and to me, and to the particular sealed space of a living room in Georgia in February, where two people who have been not saying things to each other for 33 years began saying them. What I will tell you is its shape. I told him what I had found. I was direct. I presented the information the way I would present it in a clinical context. Not without feeling but with clarity, because clarity was what I needed and what this moment required. I told him about the nursing notes. I told him about the other patient. I told him about the charge nurse, Geetha. I told him that I had spent 27 years carrying a name that had been given to me for reasons I now understood, and that I needed him to tell me what was true. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he told me, there had been a woman. He did not use her name, and I did not ask for it. There had been a relationship, years before my birth, he said, En. And I held my clinical training in front of me, like a shield, and did not challenge the timeline, because challenging the timeline was not the point. There had been a child, a daughter, born 1 day before me, in the same hospital, which was a coincidence that he described with the expression of a man who has had 33 years to examine a coincidence and has never fully made peace with it. He had not been present in the other woman's life. He had not been present in that child's life. He did not know, he said, where that child was now or what she knew of him. He had spent my entire childhood unable to separate me from the convergence of those facts. Unable to look at me without seeing the thing he had done and the impossible circumstance it had produced, and the marriage that had fractured and the wife who had left, and the daughter he had held in the hospital while his other daughter was being measured and scored. In the next room, he had named me for all of it. He said, I didn't know how to fix it, so I didn't. I sat with that for a long time. Then I said, fixing it wasn't available. Seeing me was. He closed his eyes. I have thought a great deal about the other daughter. The one born 1 day before me in the same hospital. The one he photographed with what the nursing note called apparent emotional investment. Yushi. The one he left and did not return to. She is, by the arithmetic, approximately 33 years old. She is out there somewhere, living a life I know nothing about. She may know who her father is. She may not. Yipti. She has her own story and her own history and her own accounting of what she received and what she was owed. I have thought about finding her, Inti. I have thought about it seriously, and with the full weight of what it would mean, for her, for me, for the information she may or may not have, and may or may not want, even the. I have talked about it in therapy, and I have made no decision, which is itself a decision. The decision to hold the question open until I understand more fully what I would be walking toward. What I know is this. She is not responsible for what was done with her existence. She is, Like me, a person who was born into circumstances she did not design. She is not the princess to my mistake, not the favored one, gain. Not the explanation for my diminishment. She is simply another person shaped by the same man's choices, from a different position, with a different set of missing information. If I find her someday, I would like to tell her that Lily knows. I told her in March, over a long phone call that lasted into the night, and that she received with the particular quality of a person hearing information that reorganizes prior experiences without making them easier to hold. Lily said, "So the princess wasn't about me either." I said, "No." She was quiet. Then she said, "He needed one of us to be perfect and one of us to be the reason. That's what we were." My sister, Geet, who is a marketing director and not a therapist, arrived at a clinical formulation in one sentence that took me years of training to reach. I told her she was right. She was entirely right. Cynthia. We had been cast in a dynamic that was about his internal experience, his guilt, his unprocessed choices, his need to manage a narrative about himself that could not accommodate his own culpability. He had made Lily perfect so she could be proof that he was a good father. He had made me the mistake so I could absorb the evidence that he wasn't. We had been props in a story about him. Neither of us had been seen. My father and I have spoken 7 times since the February conversation. Not all of the calls are about the history. Most of them are not, because there is a limit to how much of this particular territory can be traveled in a single season. And because we are also just a father and a daughter who talk about his cardiac rehabilitation, and my practice, and the weather in Georgia, and the weather in Portland, and the ordinary contents of lives being lived in the ongoing present. Eat me. But he has said things, across those 7 calls, that I am assembling into something, not an apology, exactly. He is not a man built for the full architecture of apology, and I have stopped requiring that architecture, because requiring it was costing me more than it was giving me. What he has said are specific things, offered carefully, with the deliberateness of a man who has learned late that words have weight. He said in April, "You were never a mistake. That was mine to carry. I put it on you." 7 words that reorganized my chest. I did not say they were enough, because they were not. I said thank you, because they were real, and real matters. In June, he asked me about my work, not as pleasantry, specifically, He asked what it was like to sit with people who had grown up in families where the damage was not named. I told him it was the most important work I knew how to do. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I imagine you're good at it," I said. "I learned from the best material." There was a pause. Then he made the sound that is not quite a laugh. It was the same sound from the dinner table when I was 6 years old and I had just knocked over the milk. But it was a different sound. 33 years had happened to it, and the hospital in February, and 7 phone calls, and all the things we had said and not said and begun to say. It was the same sound, and it was entirely different. I practice as a trauma-informed therapist. Every day I sit across from people who are carrying names they were given before they could speak. Not always literal names, but the equivalent. The black sheep, the difficult one, the one who was too much. The one who was not enough, the one who arrived at the wrong time, in the wrong circumstances, as the evidence of something an adult could not face. I sit with them in those names. I help them, slowly and imperfectly, and over significant time, to locate the actual source of the name. To understand that the naming was about the namer, that the verdict was issued before the evidence was available, that the child who received it was innocent of everything except existing at a particular moment in a particular family's particular crisis. I am good at this work. I have always been good at it. I am good at it because I have read the nursing notes. Because I sat in a parking garage in Georgia for 2 hours with a manila folder. Because I know, with the precision of a person who has found the actual document, that the premises were wrong from the beginning. You can spend a lifetime performing your way out of a verdict. I know. I did it for decades, with considerable dedication, Peen, with excellent grades and professional achievement, and the thorough cultivation of usefulness. None of it changes the verdict, because the verdict was never about you. What changes the verdict is finding the actual source. Ebel. Not always in paperwork. Most people do not have the particular gift of a manila folder in a parking garage. But in the truth, wherever it lives, whatever form it takes, in the conversation that finally begins. Eber. In the therapist office, in the question that breaks something open, in the realization that arrives sideways. From something someone says or something you read, or something you find on a shelf that was not supposed to be found, the source is never you. Eb. The source is never the child at the dinner table with the spilled milk. The source is always the person who was standing there first, already named, already in possession of something too heavy to carry. Honestly, Eubene. Looking for somewhere to put it down. I am 33 years old. I have a practice in Portland, and a circle of people I love, and a life I have built carefully and on purpose, Eb, with full awareness of the materials available to me and the ones that were withheld. Edie. I have a sister who calls me on Sundays, and who said he needed one of us to be perfect, and one of us to be the reason, and who has been the most honest mirror my family has produced. Ian. I have a father who is 67 and cardiac, and diminished and beginning, in the specific way available to him at this point in his life, to tell the truth. I have a manila folder in the filing cabinet in my office. I keep it there not as evidence against him, that is not what evidence is for, but as the document of my own restoration. The record that says, it was never about you, it was always his. Ida. You were a child at a dinner table with a dish towel, and the name was never yours, and now you have the paperwork that proves it. I have a name my father gave me at 6 years old that I have been releasing, carefully and imperfectly, and for the rest of my life, the way you release something that was fastened very tight for a very long time. Not all at once, not completely, but progressively, with intention, with the knowledge of what it actually was, and where it actually came from. I am Jess. That is my name. I chose it. I have always chosen it. Evil. Even when I was 6 and cleaning up milk, and someone was trying to give me a different one. I am Jess, and I am not a mistake. I was born into one. There is a significant difference. If this story reached you, if you have a name, a role, a verdict you were handed before you were old enough to contest it, I want to say this to you as directly as I know how. The verdict is not final, EBC. It was issued by someone working from incomplete information, from their own damage, their own shame, their own unprocessed material that required a container and found one in you. The verdict tells you everything about the state of the person who issued it, and nothing about your actual worth, or your actual belonging, or your actual right to take up space in the family that named you wrong. Find the source. Not to punish the person who named you. To free yourself from the name. It is in the paperwork somewhere. It is in the conversation that hasn't happened yet. It is in the question you have been not asking, because you learned early that asking was not safe or productive or permitted. Ask anyway. Look anyway. Find it. Because on the other side of the source is the thing that was always true. That you arrived innocent, that you were named by someone who was not seeing you, and that the name was never, not for a single day. A verdict on who you actually are, if you're new. Share this with someone carrying a name they didn't choose. Leave a comment. I read everyone. And if you have ever cleaned up spilled milk while someone decided what to call you, you know what they were really saying, and it was never about the milk.